Each year, Harvard posted one problem no one could solve. But one night, at 2 a.m., a girl who never spoke and only cleaned their cups left behind an answer that changed everything. Harvard didn't need an introduction. Within its stone halls and ivy-covered windows, the world's brightest minds gathered to wrestle with ideas few could even understand. But on the second floor of its grand mathematics building, one idea stared back at them, year after year, unsolved. They called it the Crimson Problem. A single geometric puzzle written in bold red chalk at the end of a narrow corridor. Officially, it was problem number 82, a challenge first written on the board in 1992 by the legendary Professor Richard Alden, and for over 3 decades no one had cracked it. Students whispered about it late at night. Even the visiting Fields medalists had failed. The Crimson Problem had become more than a test. It was a kind of ritual, a symbol that some mountains of thought simply could not be climbed. Each September, Professor Alden, now gray-haired but sharp as ever, would rewrite it on the board in his careful hand. Each May, it remained untouched. It was no longer a question of if someone could solve it. It had become a lesson in humility. But humility was not what Sophie Lane saw when she passed the board each night. Sophie was not a student. She wasn't a professor. She wasn't even part of the academic staff. She worked in the grounds and hospitality team, which in practical terms meant this. She brewed coffee, wiped down tables, and emptied trash bins in the basement cafe of the math building. And when the last student left and the lights dimmed, Sophie pushed her cleaning cart upstairs. She always lingered near the second-floor corridor. Her brown hair was usually tied back in a loose bun. Her uniform, a simple navy blue shirt with a faded Harvard logo, rarely caught attention. But one thing about Sophie did. She carried a small whiteboard everywhere, tucked under her arm like a secret diary. Because Sophie couldn't speak, a childhood accident, a severe fall at age 14, had damaged the part of her brain that controlled speech and structured writing. She understood language perfectly, but words wouldn't come out, not clearly, on paper or aloud. Yet her mind still worked, perhaps more vividly than ever. It worked in images, in patterns, in motion. She couldn't speak math, but she could see it. And each night when she passed the Crimson Problem, she paused, as if answering a call only she could hear. That November night, the building was empty and cold. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and old coffee grounds. A lonely radiator hummed somewhere out of sight. Sophie's shift was nearly done. But something kept her from leaving. She stood before the Crimson Problem, tall, red, and defiant on the blackboard. The old fluorescent light above flickered, throwing shadows across the crimson lines. Her gaze traced the shape slowly, reverently. It wasn't that she understood every theorem or proof behind it. No one truly did. But she felt something beneath the structure, a tension, a rhythm. Quietly, Sophie set her cleaning cart aside. She pulled out her whiteboard. Her marker moved, smooth, deliberate, no equations, no text, just curves, lines, arcs folding into spirals, shapes that seemed to breathe as if alive. To Sophie, this wasn't art. It was language, a way to speak the thoughts locked inside her mind. She worked in silence until nearly 2 a.m. Then she set the whiteboard carefully on the bench below the blackboard. One last glance at the Crimson Problem, as if saying, "I see you." Then she left. 2 floors above, Dr. Clara Monroe worked late in her office. At 34, she was one of Harvard's youngest math professors. Brilliant, methodical, and known for her ability to spot patterns others missed. She wasn't looking for brilliance that night. She just loved the silence of the old building after dark. But something made her leave her desk. A quiet pull. She followed it downstairs, and when she reached the second-floor corridor, she stopped. Down the hall, in the flickering pool of light, a girl in a janitor's badge was sketching, lost in thought. Her hand moved not with hesitation, but with certainty. Clara's breath caught. She didn't speak. She didn't want to break the fragile magic of the moment. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows and waited. The next morning, Clara returned early. On the bench beneath the crimson problem sat the whiteboard. She picked it up carefully. At first glance, it was beautiful. At second glance, something more. The geometry Sophie had drawn wasn't random. It was a deep, layered response to the crimson problem. A visual intuition of balance, tension, and transformation. It wasn't a traditional solution. It was something deeper. It was what the problem had always asked for. Understanding, not just calculation. Clara stood there a long time, holding the whiteboard like an artifact. Then she made a decision. Professor Alden arrived, annoyed at the early summons. "You dragged me here at 8 a.m. for this?" he grumbled. Clara said nothing. She handed him the whiteboard. For 3 full minutes, the old professor stared. His frown deepened, not in scorn, but in awe. "She saw it," he whispered. "She's not a student," Clara said softly. "She works in the cafe. Her name is Sophie Lane." Alden blinked. "The coffee girl?" Clara smiled gently. "Not anymore." That afternoon, Sophie returned to the cafe as usual. No one said a word. But somehow everything felt different, not cold, not silent, seen, heard, acknowledged. Without speaking a word, Sophie had changed the conversation. And Harvard, though it didn't know it yet, would never be the same. Sophie Lane had no idea her drawing had been noticed. She didn't expect it to be. For 2 years, the small whiteboard she carried had been her voice, her therapy, her refuge. It had started after the accident. She remembered almost nothing of that icy winter day, except the sound of her father's voice. "You're okay, Sophie? You're okay?" As her world blurred around her. At first, they all said it was a miracle that she survived. Then came the harder truth. Her speech center had been damaged. She could no longer produce fluent language. Not aloud, not even clearly in writing. Words emerged as fragments, sounds trapped behind glass. For months she fought it, screamed into pillows, tried to force her voice to return, but grief built around her like stone. School became impossible. Teachers labeled her emotionally delayed, special needs, slow. But she wasn't slow. Her mind raced with images, connections, shapes. One afternoon, out of frustration, she picked up an old whiteboard in the basement of their apartment and began to draw. Arcs, triangles, spirals that unfolded like a quiet song only she could hear. And when her mother found her sitting among the scattered sketches, she whispered, voice trembling, "That's beautiful, Sophie." It wasn't much, but it was enough. From then on, the whiteboard came everywhere with her. At 17, Sophie had left formal school. The public library became her classroom. She devoured free online lectures, MIT courses, Khan Academy, YouTube talks on geometry, physics, and pattern theory. The more she watched, the more the world seemed to pulse with structure beneath the surface. But when she tried to explain it, no one listened. Not because they were cruel, because she couldn't speak their language anymore. So she drew. Late at night, in the quiet of their small Cambridge apartment, Sophie filled her whiteboard with patterns, layered geometries that felt alive. Sometimes they came to her in dreams, silent visions of shapes in motion. And always, when she finished a drawing, the restlessness inside her eased. It was as if the whiteboard listened when nothing else could. When she took the job at Harvard's Math Building Cafe, Sophie didn't think of it as an opportunity. It was a way to help her mother, who now worked double shifts at a local bakery. Harvard intimidated her at first. She wasn't supposed to belong in a place like this. But the old buildings called to her. Their worn floors, the chalk-dusted air, the faint hum of thought that seemed to linger in the walls. She worked quietly. The staff liked her for that. She never complained, never caused trouble. She made coffee, refilled sugar jars, and wiped mugs left behind by some of the world's most brilliant minds. And when her shift ended late at night, she walked the upper floors alone. That was where she found it, the crimson problem. A triangle, stark, balanced, strange, and around it, arcs and constraints that had stumped Harvard's best for 3 decades. She didn't know the history at first. She only knew that something about it felt unfinished. She began sketching responses on her own whiteboard, not out of ambition, but because the shapes wouldn't leave her alone. And with each visit, her drawings became more elaborate. Arcs of tension, layered transformations, whispers of a language deeper than proofs. But never, not once, did she expect anyone would see them. Until now. Dr. Clara Monroe could not stop thinking about the drawing. It had haunted her since dawn, that strange cascade of geometries Sophie had left beneath the crimson problem. It wasn't a traditional proof. No equations, no text, but it was beautiful, purposeful, a visual reasoning that whispered not how the problem could be solved, but why it might have been misunderstood for so long. Clara's instinct told her this was no accident, and as the morning passed, she found herself noticing something. In every prior late-night walk she had seen Sophie, quietly pushing her cart, whiteboard always under one arm. She began to wonder what else had she missed. That afternoon, Clara waited until the cafe was nearly empty. Sophie was behind the counter, wiping the espresso machine with quiet focus. Clara approached gently. "Hi," she said softly. Sophie looked up, startled, not by the voice, but by the direct eye contact. It was rare for anyone to address her that way. "I'm Dr. Monroe," Clara continued, her tone warm. "I teach upstairs in the math department." Sophie blinked, then nodded politely, eyes darting toward the floor. Clara held up her hands. "I wanted to say, I saw your drawing on the whiteboard." A pause. Then Sophie reached for her board, flipped it, and wrote carefully, "I didn't mean to touch the blackboard. I'm sorry." Clara smiled. "You didn't touch it. What you did was extraordinary." Another pause. Sophie erased the message, then wrote again. "It's not real math. Just pictures I think about." Clara took a breath. "Sometimes that's the most real kind of math there is." For the first time, something shifted behind Sophie's eyes, a glimmer of cautious curiosity. Clara pressed gently. "Would it be okay if we talked again? You don't have to speak. I'd just love to see more of what you draw." Sophie hesitated, then wrote, "Okay." And in that small moment, a door opened. One neither of them could yet see fully, but one that would change both their lives. From that day on, they began to meet, not formally, not with schedules or rules, but every few days, Clara would bring coffee to the cafe when it was quiet, and Sophie would allow her to sit nearby, a silent observer as her marker traced new worlds onto her whiteboard. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Sophie drew. Clara watched. Sometimes Clara would point gently to a shape and ask, "What does this mean to you?" Sophie would pause, then add something, a mirrored form, a sequence, an echo, as if to say, "Look deeper. It moves." Over time, their exchange became a private language, a geometry of the unspoken. Clara began to document Sophie's work, not digitally, but in a leather-bound notebook. Each sketch was a window into something profound, a different way of seeing, one that bypassed traditional proof entirely. And as the days passed, Clara's conviction grew stronger. Perhaps the crimson problem had remained unsolved for so long not because it was too hard, but because everyone had been looking at it the wrong way. Maybe it wasn't numbers that would unlock it. Maybe it was shapes, shadows, silence, and maybe, just maybe, it had been waiting all this time for someone who couldn't speak, but could see. Sophie Lane didn't know that Dr. Clara Monroe had begun collecting her sketches. She didn't know that Professor Richard Alden, the man who had written The Crimson Problem 30 years ago, had stared at her whiteboard for 3 silent minutes, shaken. She didn't know that Clara had stayed up half the night, poring over her drawings and wondering, what else does she see? Because Sophie had never expected to be seen at all. The whiteboard was her sanctuary. At home, in the small apartment she shared with her mother, Sophie often drew late into the night. Not copying, but chasing invisible shapes her mind seemed to conjure on its own. Circles folding into spirals, triangles breathing like living things. She wasn't trying to solve anything. She was listening, trying to follow the currents of motion she felt beneath the surface of each form. Sometimes, when it worked, the drawing gave her peace. Other times, it left her restless, as if the picture was only the first layer of something deeper she hadn't yet reached. But she always returned to it. It was the one place where silence became voice. And now, someone had noticed. Clara found herself thinking constantly about Sophie's drawings. She began to review them alongside published papers on the crimson problem. To her astonishment, several of Sophie's visual sequences mapped naturally onto concepts in projective geometry, fields even advanced researchers struggled to articulate clearly. Yet Sophie had drawn them intuitively, fluidly, without reference. It wasn't mimicry, it was insight. And Clara began to suspect something even more radical, that Sophie's way of seeing wasn't an accident. It was a gift, one that could reframe the problem entirely. But not everyone at Harvard welcomed change. One evening, Sophie sat sketching outside Lecture Hall 204, waiting for her shift to begin. Students poured out of a seminar room, laughing and chatting. Sophie remained unnoticed, her marker tracing soft arcs, until a voice cut through the crowd. "Hey, designing latte art?" Professor Gerald Whitmore, an ambitious, sharp-tongued young professor known more for ego than empathy, smirked at her from across the hall. A few students chuckled. Sophie looked up, not with anger, but with something almost sad. Then, without a word, she erased her drawing and quietly packed her whiteboard. She was used to this. Invisible, misunderstood. But it still stung. What Sophie didn't see was Clara, standing at the far end of the hall, watching. She didn't confront. Whitmore, then. She waited. That evening, Clara invited him into her office and laid Sophie's sketches in front of him. "Look at these." Whitmore scoffed at first, then frowned. "These are hers?" "Yes," Clara said simply, "and some of them align with ideas from your own thesis." His smirk faded. She did this without formulas? She doesn't need them. For once, Whitmore had no reply. The next day, Clara approached Sophie gently in the cafe. Would you like to try something? Sophie blinked. I have a classroom free tonight. I thought we could set up a clear board. You could draw on it, layer by layer. I want to see how you think in motion. Sophie hesitated, then wrote, Okay. That evening, under soft light in the empty classroom, Clara set up a large, transparent acrylic panel. This is yours, she said. Draw however you like, I'll just watch. Sophie approached cautiously, then with growing curiosity. She began to draw, arcs that unfolded into spirals, triangles layered with shifting curves, forms that seemed to move as they emerged. Clara stood back, breathless. This, she whispered to herself, is what math was always meant to be. But brilliance is rarely left in peace. That weekend, Sophie missed 2 shifts. On Monday, she returned pale, her eyes red. Clara found her in the cafe. Are you okay? She asked gently. Sophie wrote, My mom was hospitalized. She's better now. I'm sorry I missed the lesson. Clara placed a hand gently on hers. You never have to apologize. For a moment, Sophie didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. From then on, their sessions deepened. Week by week, Sophie's drawings grew more layered, more daring. Clara documented everything, convinced now that the crimson problem wasn't about solving it all. Maybe, Clara thought, it was never numbers we needed. Maybe it was this. And as Sophie's hand traced new arcs onto the clear board, Clara felt it in her bones. The problem wasn't waiting for an answer. It was waiting to be understood. And finally, through Sophie's silent language, it was beginning to speak. Sophie Lane didn't think of herself as an artist, nor a mathematician, nor anything special at all. She was simply a girl who drew, because drawing was the only way her thoughts could breathe. Late at night, when her shift ended, Sophie would return to the small storage room behind the cafe. There, beneath flickering lights and the scent of coffee grounds, she sat on the floor, whiteboard balanced on her knees, and let her mind speak. Lines emerged, then curves, then something deeper, an unspoken conversation between form and feeling. She rarely knew where the drawings came from, only that when she surrendered to them, the world felt less heavy, and sometimes, just sometimes, the shapes seemed to whisper back. Dr. Clara Monroe had begun following those whispers. Every few days, Sophie would leave a new drawing beneath the crimson problem. She never erased them. She layered them, one atop the next. A visual conversation that deepened with each passing week. And Clara, watching quietly from a distance, began to document it all. Not just the drawings, the language Sophie was inventing. She's not solving the problem, Clara wrote in her journal. She's transforming it, from a wall into a window. Others began to notice. It started with a folded email on Clara's desk. Where did these sketches come from? There's something raw in them, something familiar. Dr. Lena Merrick, professor of topology. Clara smiled. The door had cracked open. Meanwhile, Sophie remained unaware. She still drew for herself, for the crimson problem, for the quiet voice inside her that would not be silenced. Each night she returned to the corridor, whiteboard in hand, and traced new forms. Triangles bending softly into arcs, spirals that wrapped around shifting centers, lines that hinted at unseen dimensions. To anyone else, it might have looked like abstract art. To Sophie, it was a conversation. I see you, Each drawing whispered to the stubborn red triangle, "And I am listening." One evening, Clara approached with something new, a small, leather-bound notebook. "I know you like whiteboards," she said softly, "but I thought maybe you'd want something that stays." Sophie turned it over in her hands, then wrote, "Do you think I'm strange?" Clara smiled. "Number, I think you're one of the most brilliant minds I've ever met." Sophie hesitated, then opened the notebook and wrote a single word on the first page. "Listen." That night, at home, Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, her father's old flannel shirt draped across her lap. She hadn't touched it in years. The fabric still smelled faintly of pine and sunlight. Her father had been her greatest champion, long before the accident took her voice. He'd called her his invisible genius. "Just because no one sees the sun when it's raining," he used to say, "doesn't mean it, isn't shining." Now, with the notebook open before her, Sophie drew for him. Arcs that moved like breath, triangles that pulsed with gentle tension, spirals that danced toward unseen centers. For hours she drew, and for the first time in years, as the pages fluttered around her like falling snow, she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. The next morning, Clara placed 6 of Sophie's drawings in the department lounge, beneath the old skylight. She left no explanation, no name, just a single sticky note. "Look, don't analyze." By evening, the sketches had been rearranged, 2 turned sideways, 1 faintly marked with a question mark, but none dismissed, and an email landed quietly in Clara's inbox. "Where did these come from? There's something here. Something we've been missing. Dr. Merrick." The door was opening wider. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her silent dialogue with the crimson problem. One evening, as she sketched a new sequence, triangles folding into spirals, a familiar voice cut through the quiet. "Are those planets?" A young student stood nearby, eyes wide. Sophie blinked, then nodded. "It looks like they're pulling each other," the student whispered. Sophie smiled softly. Someone had understood. That night, Clara arrived with coffee and a folder. "I want to show you something," she said. Inside were 3 printed emails, all from professors, all expressing fascination. Sophie froze, then wrote, "You told them?" "Not your name," Clara said gently. "Not yet, just your work." Sophie stared, then wrote, "They'll laugh." Clara met her eyes. They already stopped. And so, a quiet revolution began. A few professors, cautiously at first, began appearing in the cafe. Not for coffee, not for conversation, for sketches. Dr. Merrick lingered near the counter, eyes flicking toward Sophie's board. Professor Doyle left a folded note. Would love to see more, or hear more, or both. Sophie didn't reply in words. She replied in drawings. Her sketches became more layered, more deliberate. She began experimenting with time, drawing sequences that unfolded like visual proofs. By week's end, Clara gathered the new sketches and arranged them in a small lecture room. She invited 5 professors. "You don't have to be there," she told Sophie. "But you deserve to be." That night, Sophie stood just outside the door, knees tucked beneath her, listening. Inside, the professors sat in silence as Clara spoke. "What if the mind doesn't need words to reason?" A pause. Then Dr. Merrick leaned forward. "This isn't intuition. This is intelligence that chooses silence." Clara nodded. "Because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's concentration." Later that night, Sophie returned to the crimson problem. The corridor was empty. The air smelled faintly of chalk and memory. She stood before the red triangle and closed her eyes. Then, slowly, she began to draw. Not a solution, a response. Arcs spiraled gently around the triangle's edges, lines refracted through imaginary surfaces, a dance of tension and release, of curiosity and respect. She left the whiteboard propped beneath the crimson problem and walked away. And as she did, a single thought rose clear within her. Maybe some problems aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to be understood. Professor Richard Alden arrived early the next morning. It was a habit. Even in retirement, the old mathematician couldn't stay away from the second-floor corridor. The crimson problem was his creation, his unsolved gift to Harvard. But this morning something new waited for him. From 30 feet away he saw it, a whiteboard, propped beneath the blackboard. He approached, eyes narrowing, and then he stopped breathing. Arcs spiraled softly around the familiar red triangle. Light lines refracted through imagined surfaces. Rotating layers unfolded like the delicate gears of a hidden clock. It wasn't a solution. It was a conversation, a visual language that reframed the problem entirely. For 2 full minutes, Alden sat on the bench, staring. When Dr. Clara Monroe found him there, he looked up. "She's not solving it," he said quietly. "She's reimagining it." Clara nodded. "She sees it the way music is seen by someone who can't hear." Alden rubbed his forehead. "I wrote that problem in 1992. Thought it was about balance. But she's showing me it was about tension." Clara knelt beside him. "She's been drawing like this for years." Alden blinked. "And no one knew. We're listening now." Later that afternoon, Clara called Sophie into her office. Sophie sat quietly across from her, notebook in hand. "I've been asked to give a lecture at the Winter Symposium," Clara began. "The theme is Intuition in Advanced Problem Solving." Sophie tilted her head, curious. "I want to present your work." Sophie quickly wrote, "You should present your work." Clara smiled gently. "I didn't draw any of this. You did. You changed how this problem feels. That's more than solution. That's art. That's impact." Sophie hesitated, then wrote slowly, "I can't present. I can't speak." "Then we'll find another way," Clara said. Over the next 2 weeks, they built the presentation together. No slides, no bullet points, no spoken narration. Just Sophie's drawings, animated slowly, projected like starlight onto a black canvas. Clara would guide the audience with brief transitions, but the shapes would speak for themselves. They called it the silent geometry of seeing. The night before the symposium, Sophie stayed late in the empty cafe. She caught her reflection in the espresso machine, her own eyes looking back with something new. Not fear, not sadness, readiness. She reached into her bag, pulled out her whiteboard, and wrote, "Maybe I was never meant to speak. Maybe I was meant to draw the words the world forgot." The Winter Symposium was held in Lyman Hall, a rotunda of stone and glass where echoes of ideas lingered long after lectures ended. But this year, there was a different kind of hum in the air. Have you heard about the final slot? The silent presentation. They say it's not even math, just shapes. Curious minds gathered slowly at first, then eagerly. By the time Clara stepped onto the stage, the room was full. Students sat on the floor. Researchers stood in the aisles. Laptops were closed. Phones were silent. And Sophie Lane, dressed in a soft gray sweater, her whiteboard resting on her lap, sat just beside the stage, just out of the spotlight. Clara spoke softly. "Some people speak with numbers, some with words, but some speak with motion. What you're about to see is not a solution to a famous problem. It's something rarer, a conversation with it." She stepped back. The lights dimmed, and the screen came alive. It began with a triangle, not the crimson problem itself, but its silhouette, outlined in soft white chalk on black. Then arcs appeared, gentle at first, rippling outward. Spirals folded inward like breath. Curved paths overlapped, hinting at layers beneath layers. The triangle shifted, bent, breathed. Intersections glowed faint gold. Motion unfolded like the turning of unseen gears. No equations, no voice, just movement. The audience leaned forward, not with confusion, with reverence. They weren't watching a proof, they were watching poetry. At the back of the room, Alden stood, arms crossed, his usual scowl absent. For decades, I defended this problem, he thought. Called it a mirror of limits. But maybe it never needed a solver. Maybe it needed a listener. As the final sequence unfolded, the triangle split into 3 layers. Each rotated slightly, showing motion through time. Then for 5 seconds, the screen went dark. Finally, one last frame appeared, a faint white arc balanced on a shadow's point. A question mark, not drawn, but implied. Beneath it, pale gray text. Some problems aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be understood. The room was frozen. No one clapped. Not yet. Because no one could quite breathe. Then, one student near the front stood and began to applaud. Then another, and another, until the rotunda shook with sound. It was thunderous, it was long, and it was for a girl who had not spoken a single word. Sophie stood slowly. Her hands trembled as she held her whiteboard to her chest. Clara came to her side and whispered, "You did it." Sophie didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and felt it. Not pride, not relief, but peace. For once the world had heard her, exactly as she was. The room was still humming hours after the silent presentation ended. Professors whispered. Students stared into the space where the shapes had danced. Some took notes they would never fully explain. Some simply sat, silent, moved in ways words could not reach. And as the rotunda slowly emptied, Sophie Lane sat quietly beside the stage. Her whiteboard balanced on her knees, eyes closed, breathing in the peace that had eluded her for so long. The next morning, a small cream-colored envelope waited in Sophie's university mailbox. No return address, no name. Just her name, written in careful script, Miss Sophie Lane, Harvard Mathematics Cafe. She held it gently, as one holds a relic or a fragile feather. She hadn't expected praise, not congratulations, certainly not this. Hands trembling, she opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of linen paper. At the top, a sentence written in deliberate cursive, "I knew your father." Sophie froze. Her father. She hadn't spoken of him in years, not even to Dr. Clara Monroe. The grief had solidified into something quiet. Not pain exactly, but weight. A silence that did not ache, simply remained. She read on. He once told me, "My daughter sees the world in ways I never could. She talks about numbers like they're people. I don't understand any of it, but I believe she'll teach us how to listen to what we've forgotten." At the time, I thought he was being poetic, overly proud. After watching, "Your lecture, I understand. Thank you for proving him right." At the bottom, one final line. "Keep drawing. Even the sky has shapes no one has named yet." No signature, no clue who had written it. But Sophie didn't need one. That night, she brought the letter to Clara. They sat on the floor of Clara's office, surrounded by notebooks and markers. Clara read it twice, then looked up softly. "Do you think it's someone he worked with?" Sophie shrugged, then wrote, "Does it matter?" Clara smiled. "Maybe it's better that way." For a long time, they sat in companionable silence. Then, slowly, Sophie picked up her whiteboard and began to sketch. Not the crimson problem, not arcs or triangles, but him, her father's broad shoulders, the curve of his smile, the sunflower he used to tuck behind one ear. She didn't draw it like a portrait. She drew it like a memory. Unclear, but true. The next morning, Sophie arrived early to the cafe, before the coffee had started brewing, before students began yawning toward their first class. She carried a new sketch, the one she'd drawn for her father. She pinned it gently to the community cork board near the espresso machine. Beneath it, in soft print, she wrote, "For the one who remembered." Across campus, in the philosophy department, Henry Dalton sat at his desk. Old now, nearly 70, he had once worked alongside Sophie's father in the building's maintenance crew. He remembered the daughter, the quiet storm of a child who once explained infinity to him using paper clips and orange juice. He had attended the silent presentation, not knowing Sophie would be there. And when her name appeared on the program, he had wept quietly, without shame. Afterward, he had written the letter, careful, deliberate, without introducing himself, because he didn't want to interrupt her journey. He simply wanted her to know, "You were always meant to be seen." That same week, a new invitation arrived. MIT's Visual Mathematics Lab wanted Sophie to join a collaborative project. They didn't ask for transcripts, they didn't ask for speeches, they asked for one thing. "Will you teach us what you see?" Sophie said yes, without needing words, but not everyone welcomed the shift. Professor Gerald Whitmore, the same who had once mocked her, published a lengthy public post. "Romanticizing intuition is dangerous. Mathematics must remain grounded in proof, not performance. Beware elevating mystique over method." The post spread quickly. Some agreed, many pushed back, and one reply stood out. A simple comment from a Kansas high school student named Maya Thompson. "I have a speech delay. I used to think that meant I'd never be part of math or science. But after watching Sophie Lane, I realized maybe I don't need to talk like everyone else. Maybe I just need to see like myself. If that's mystique, maybe that's what math has been missing." The reply received more likes than the original post. Sophie read it twice, then printed it, folded it, and taped it inside the cover of her sketchbook. By Friday, something else arrived at her desk. A small cardboard tube. Inside, a rolled parchment. At first, Sophie thought it was another sketch, but when she unrolled it, she gasped. It was the crimson problem, but not in red chalk, in gold ink, reframed, with her geometry traced gently along its edges, the same forms from her silent presentation. Beneath it, embossed, co-authored solution in visual logic R. Alden and S. Lane. Her hand trembled. For years, she had cleaned the dust from beneath that board. Now, her name lived on it, not as a cleaner, as a contributor. That night, Sophie stood again in the quiet corridor. She traced her fingers over the new plaque, then sat on the bench, whiteboard beside her, eyes closed. And for the first time, she didn't draw. She just sat, breathing, letting the silence hold her, not isolate her. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall, and in the warm hush of the corridor, Sophie Lane, the girl who had never spoken a word into a microphone, felt more heard than most people ever would. The invitation arrived not in a formal letter, not from an academic conference. It came as a simple postcard, handmade, thick watercolor paper with smudged corners. Across the front, one sentence, handwritten, "Would you show them how you see?" It was signed by Lydia Carter, a public school teacher in Roxbury, just outside Boston. Beneath the signature, a scribbled note in another hand. P.S. They won't care that you don't talk. Most of them barely listen anyway. When Sophie Lane read it, she smiled, not with her lips, with her eyes, and she wrote one word in her notebook. Yes, The school was old. Red brick, cracked playground, a flickering sign. Everett Community Learning Center. Inside, the walls were covered in murals, some beautiful, others chaotic. Near the entrance, one painting caught Sophie's eye. A child holding a chalkboard over their heart. On the board, a spiral. Beneath it, painted in block letters, "We are not blank slates. We are already full of something." Lydia Carter greeted her with a grin and paint on her jeans. "You're Sophie," she said warmly. "You look exactly like someone who doesn't waste words." Sophie nodded, eyes shining. Lydia led her to room 12. It looked nothing like a typical math classroom. No desks, no blackboards, no rigid rows, just beanbags, floor cushions, low tables, and a giant white wall covered in dry erase paint. "This," Lydia said proudly, "is where I teach math." Sophie blinked, then smiled. The students trickled in. 9 children, aged 10 to 13, some neurodivergent, some nonverbal. One boy wore headphones the entire time. Another girl brought a stuffed lion and refused to sit without it. Lydia clapped her hands. "Okay, folks, this is Sophie. She's going to show us some stuff today. There won't be a quiz, but if your brain doesn't hurt by the end, she did something wrong." The kids laughed. Sophie picked up a marker. She didn't speak. She drew a triangle, then a circle brushing its base, then another circle, smaller, inside. A hand shot up. "Are those planets?" Sophie paused, then nodded. She rotated the image, drew faint curved lines between points. Another student whispered, "It's like they're pulling each other." Lydia jumped in. "What you're seeing is gravity, but through geometry." Sophie kept drawing. The triangle bent, the circles connected. One shape became 2, then 3, then none. A boy on the floor raised both arms. "Yo! This is like a video game level where you fall forever." Sophie's eyes sparkled. They got it. Not through equations, through motion. Next, Sophie introduced a game. Not a math game, a shadow game. She placed cutouts on the overhead projector. Strange, irregular shapes. Then, without speaking, she gestured. What would this look like if turned? Each child scribbled on whiteboards, then ran to the wall to draw. Some were close, some were not. But all were thinking, and to Sophie, that was sacred. Afterwards, Lydia approached her. "They've never been that still for anything but snack time." Sophie laughed soundlessly, her whole face glowing, then wrote, "They think in shapes, too." Lydia nodded. "Most of us do, but we forget." 2 weeks later, Lydia emailed Clara Monroe. Subject, "She's magic." Body. Sophie didn't just teach them, she gave them permission to be brilliant in ways the curriculum never planned for. One of my boys, Malik, he's never drawn anything in math. Today, he handed me a spiral that made me dizzy. When I asked him what it was, he said, "It's how numbers feel when I'm listening to music." That's what Sophie unlocked. Not math, belief. When Clara read it, she forwarded it quietly to Richard Alden. He didn't reply. But later that day, a bouquet of sunflowers arrived at the cafe. No note, just the gesture. When Sophie saw them, she smiled. She knew exactly where they belonged. On a snowy Sunday, Sophie returned to Everett Community School. This time she brought something new. Not her whiteboard. A roll of canvas, 6 feet long, covered in interlocking curves, arcs, strange fractals. She unrolled it across the classroom floor, then handed each student a brush. No instructions, just colors. Within minutes, the canvas was alive. Some traced over her geometry. Others invented new ones. One child painted stars across a parabola. Another scribbled, "I feel smart inside a circle." And in the center, Beneath all the layers, Sophie added one phrase in soft pencil. What if the world is already trying to show us everything, but we've been looking too straight? Later that night, Sophie sat at home beside her window, sketchbook open. She wasn't drawing the crimson problem, or her father, or lectures. She was drawing her students, their faces, when something clicked. The way they tilted their heads when a new idea landed. She drew them as stars, each one spinning around the others, not as followers, not as teachers, just together. And at the bottom of the page she wrote, "The best classrooms aren't rooms, they're mirrors." The envelope bore the gold-embossed seal of the university. Inside, a folded letter with formal language. The Committee on Academic Innovation and Traditions formally invites Ms. Sophie Lane to present a visual discourse at the 144th Annual Harvard Assembly. It was signed by 7 names, 7 men and women who for decades had dictated what Harvard celebrated and what it didn't. When Dr. Clara Monroe read the letter, she whispered, "They're not just watching now. They're responding." In her office, Clara sat across from Sophie. Sophie held the letter in her lap, expression unreadable. She picked up her board and wrote, "What did they expect?" Clara hesitated, then answered honestly, "Truthfully, a show, a curiosity, but maybe what they need is a mirror." Sophie underlined her next message. "Then I'll be a mirror." The assembly was held in Sanders Theater, a cathedral of ideas, high arches, velvet seats, portraits of past deans peering down from walnut walls. No whiteboard had ever entered its stage until now. Sophie didn't wear a gown or a blazer. She wore her cafe uniform shirt under a soft gray sweater, not to make a statement, but because she never had to change who she was to become who they noticed. Backstage, Clara asked quietly, "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" Sophie looked at her and smiled, not in reassurance, in readiness. The theater dimmed, chatter faded. At exactly 6 p.m., Sophie walked onto the wide wooden stage, carrying a single object, a large, portable, transparent whiteboard wheeled in like a quiet monument. She said nothing. She didn't bow. She simply began to draw. It started with a circle, then another, intersecting it, then a triangle, not inside, but beside the first figure. Some in the audience leaned forward, others squinted, but no one looked away. Sophie added curves, notations in motion, not symbols. The drawings weren't abstract. They were emotive. You didn't need a degree to feel them. In the front row, Dean Halifax, sharp-suited, known for brutal rebuttals, frowned. This was the same girl who once cleaned mugs in his conference room. Now she was rewriting the language of insight, without speaking. Next to him, Professor Lenore Ballard, chair of symbolic systems, leaned toward a colleague. She's not just communicating, she's translating cognition itself. At the 15-minute mark, Sophie paused, turned the board slowly. The lights dimmed. A second projection began behind her. Photographs of her earlier sketches, layered in sequences. They rippled like time-lapse footage of thought. At the center, the triangle from the crimson problem, now reframed in dozens of geometric echoes. The audience gasped, not at a solution, at a story, a feeling. Sophie wasn't solving a theorem, she was solving the distance between minds. Then, just before the end, she drew one final image, a mirror. On one side, a scholar with a chalkboard. On the other, a girl with a mop bucket. The same shape hovered between them. She stepped back, put down the marker, and waited. The applause didn't come at first. No one wanted to break the moment. Then, slowly, hands came together. Soft at first, then rising, until the theater shook. Not applause of politeness, applause of recognition, a thunderous sound, for a girl who had turned silence into structure. Backstage, Sophie stood quietly. Members of the committee trickled in. Dean Halifax was the first to approach. He extended a hand, then stopped. Instead, he bowed his head slightly. "I was wrong," he said softly. Sophie looked at him, then wrote, "No one is wrong forever." He blinked and smiled. The kind of humility this place needs. Later that evening, Sophie and Clara sat in the grass courtyard outside. Above them, the Harvard bell tower chimed 8 soft notes. Clara handed her a cup of tea. "You didn't just speak today," she said. "You changed what it means to speak." Sophie took a sip, then lifted her board and wrote, "The louder the world becomes, the more powerful silence grows." The next morning, someone taped a printout to the Crimson Problem Corridor wall. It read, "On March 4th, Harvard did not applaud a solution. It applauded a seer." Beneath it, a handwritten note. "We no longer wait for answers in equations. We wait for someone who can help us see them." And for the first time in its history, Sanders Theater was renamed, not after a donor, but after a drawing, a triangle, reframed, forever known as the Lane form. The email came from Geneva, brief, formal, but every word shimmered with weight. "Dear Ms. Lane, on behalf of UNESCO and the International Council for Visual Education, we would be honored to invite you to lead a segment in our Global Minds Without Borders Symposium. Your lecture, The Silent Geometry of Seeing, has reached over 12 million viewers across 34 countries. Many of them do not speak English. All of them understood you. With admiration, Dr. Noel Cho, Director, Global Educational Equity Division." Sophie Lane sat in her small apartment, the letter open beside her, a cup of jasmine tea growing cold in her hands. 12 million. She couldn't picture 12 million. She could barely picture a dozen without blinking. But what echoed louder than the number was that single line. All of them understood you. A week later, Sophie was on a plane, for the first time in her adult life. Dr. Clara Monroe came with her, not as a chaperone, as a friend, a collaborator, a steady compass. Sophie pressed her forehead to the window as the clouds parted. Below, the Alps, snow-tipped spines, curved like a vast spiral drawn by some invisible hand. It didn't look like the world. It looked like a drawing, a form the sky had tried to say for centuries, and no one had listened long enough to hear. It, until now. The symposium was held in a glass dome, a hemispherical structure on the edge of Lake Geneva, surrounded by pine trees and sharp air, designed to be a space where every voice could rise without echo. But this time, it was a space where silence would rise instead. Inside, the audience was unlike any Sophie had ever faced. Children from Sierra Leone, researchers from Finland, policymakers from Cambodia, a poet from Argentina who communicated only through touch. When Sophie entered, small, quiet, her signature portable whiteboard balanced on her hip, a hush fell across the room. Not from formality, from reverence. She had become something they had only read about. An oracle, not of prophecy, but of presence. The session was called "What Numbers Feel Like When They Dance." No translator was needed. Sophie began by placing shapes on a table. No labels, no numbers. Just motion, spirals, parabolas, shapes nested inside other shapes, not in formulas, but in color, in weight, in balance. She gave each participant a transparent tile. then gestured, inviting them to place their tile into her pattern. One by one, hands moved. A girl from Brazil added an ellipse. A boy from Vietnam rotated it. A man from Poland aligned it with a hexagon. Sophie watched as the table transformed, not into a map, into a conversation. Without a single word, 20 strangers spoke fluently, in a dialect made of distance and direction, and somehow they all understood. During lunch, Sophie sat beside a boy named Noah Kim, with cochlear implants. He pointed to her sketches and tapped his chest twice, the universal sign for I feel it. Then he pulled out a small book. Inside were his own diagrams, messy, raw, but familiar. Sophie smiled. Without hesitation, she began to draw beside him. A dialogue emerged. Not with grammar, with gravity. The translator assigned to Noah eventually stepped back, unused. At the end of their exchange, Noah drew a small rectangle shaded in blue and handed it to her. On it, in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for showing me that my way is a way." That evening, Sophie stood by the lake alone. The sky was streaked, clouds moving like breath across the horizon. She knelt, pulled out her sketch pad, and tried to draw it. But this time, it was too much, too vast, too sacred. So she didn't. She just sat and listened. The next morning, something unexpected happened. The head of the mathematics division of the French Ministry of Education approached her with an offer. They wanted to build a curriculum based entirely on her visual method. They called it Visionaire. When Clara read the proposal, she teared up. Sophie just blinked, then slowly wrote, "I'm not a teacher." Clara looked her in the eyes. "You're the only kind of teacher who changes everything." Back in Boston, the media buzzed. Articles titled, "The Girl Who Solved in Silence." She drew what we couldn't say. Harvard's most unlikely mind becomes the world's most needed one. Of course, some critics resurfaced. Mathematical theater, they called it. Educational romanticism. But for every skeptic, a dozen voices rose in support. Teachers shared videos of students engaging with geometry for the first time, not by calculating it, but by feeling it. Parents sent letters, thanking Sophie for unlocking something in their children that school had missed. And in a special segment on national television, a young girl with selective mutism was asked if she had anything to say. She picked up a marker, drew 3 spirals, then smiled and whispered, "Sophie taught me that shapes are like friends. They don't ask me to talk. They just stay." One evening, as Sophie and Clara walked through Harvard Yard beneath falling leaves, Clara turned to her. "Did you ever think the girl who cleaned mugs would become the girl who taught the sky to speak?" Sophie paused, lifted her whiteboard, drew a single shape, a line, then a circle around it, then another, and in the center, an eye. Clara smiled. "You're saying you didn't become her? You always were?" Sophie nodded, then wrote, "The world just didn't know how to read me yet." Harvard changed, not overnight, not loudly, but slowly, like frost melting from stained glass. First, the corridor of the crimson problem. The blackboard remained, but next to it, a new panel was installed, a rotating whiteboard space where students could draw ideas freely. No grades, no corrections, just exploration. It was called the listening wall. Sophie never asked for it, but one morning she found a crowd of undergrads gathered around it, watching as a freshman traced a strange series of connected arcs, with a kind of wonder only childhood used to allow. And for once, no one interrupted. They were just watching, like she once had. Next came the admissions office. Dean Halifax, the same man who once furrowed his brow at Sophie's presence, quietly advocated for a new pilot program. Visual Intuition Pathways, a review track for applicants whose brilliance might not show in standard exams, but who demonstrated exceptional pattern-based reasoning, geometry, or nonverbal cognition. It was controversial. It passed. The first person accepted under the program, Noah Kim, the boy from Geneva, with a sketchbook full of spirals and a mind full of motion. As for Sophie Lane, she never asked for a professorship. She never requested a title. But one morning, Clara found a small placard outside the newly renamed Room 204, the Sophie Lane studio, for those who shape without speaking, for those who see without asking, for those who listen beyond words. Inside the room, no desks, just cushions, white walls, light, and silence. Once a week, Sophie came and simply drew. Anyone, students, staff, strangers, was welcome to add to the wall beside her. The only rule, no talking, just seeing. And somehow, it worked better than most classrooms ever had. One autumn afternoon, a small girl came into the studio, hoodie 2 sizes too big, barely 13. She looked around nervously, then approached Sophie. Said nothing, just held out an envelope. Sophie opened it. Inside, a hand-drawn sketch of a jagged mountain range and a single sentence. "I don't have a voice that schools understand, but when I draw, it's like I become real." There was no name on the letter, but Sophie stood, walked to the back wall, and began a new sketch. Mountains, yes, but drawn in layers. The girl watched, then picked up a marker and joined in. Neither one spoke, but when they stepped back, the mountain had depth, and somehow it looked alive. Years passed. Sophie never became a celebrity. She never opened a TikTok. She never went viral the way influencers do. But she became something rarer, a legend, whispered about by students who stayed late after class, by janitors who watched her from hallways she used to clean, by mathematicians who stared at curves and felt them move. When Dr. Clara Monroe retired, she left her office mostly empty, except for a single framed sketch on the far wall. One of Sophie's earliest, a triangle, a spiral, and a small eye at the center. Beneath it, Clara added her own plaque. Some shapes teach us formulas, but this one taught me how to care. One winter, Sophie visited her father's grave. It was quiet. She knelt beside the stone and placed something beside it. Not flowers, a whiteboard, clean, blank. And on it, in soft blue marker, she wrote, "You were right. I didn't need to speak. I just needed to be seen." She sat there until the snow began to fall, soft, like erasers from the sky. Back at Harvard, someone had placed a small drawing on the listening wall. No name, no words, just a spiral wrapped inside a triangle, and a note beneath it. She didn't crack the problem. She redrew the question so the world could answer. That evening, Sophie walked through the corridor, alone, past her old cafe, past the board, past the portraits of thinkers who once stood at podiums, shouting theories into crowded rooms. She carried no bag, no board, just herself, and as she turned the final corner, she saw a student sitting on the floor, sketching. He looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Sophie knelt beside him, drew a line, then a curve. He stared, then smiled, and added his own. 2 strangers, 2 shapes, and something shared. Not every legacy is carved in stone. Some are drawn in silence, then left, like chalk, for the next hand to pick up. The end.